Libya has plunged into chaos and lawlessness since the fall of longtime dictator Muammar Gaddafi 3 years ago. Government authorities virtually disintegrated in almost all parts of the oil-rich country. Terrorism and militancy is on the rise. The lawlessness has allowed terrorists to move weapons and fighters easily across borders. The economy of the once rich Arab country is also in shambles. The government lacks the power or apparently the will to act against striking guards and mutinous military units linked to secessionist forces who've occupied oil ports and exporting facilities. So why has Libya descended into chaos? Why is the central government so weak? And why is NATO and the countries that supported its 2011 attack on Libya being blamed? I'm Homa Lezgi and you're watching The Debate.
Concerns are growing in Libya over the government's ability to maintain stability in the country. For many Libyans, the government has no real power. The oil-rich country is facing the threat of disintegration as militia groups are fomenting violence and targeting even diplomats in the North African country. On Monday, a Libyan extremist group released a video of a Tunisian diplomat recently abducted in Tripoli. The footage shows Mohammed bin Sheikh pleading with Tunisian authorities to negotiate with his captors and secure his release. He is one of two officials recently kidnapped from the Tunisian embassy. According to Tunisian sources, the captors are demanding the release of Libyans jailed for their role in a 2011 attack which killed 2 Tunisian police officers. The abductions were part of a string of attacks on diplomats in Libya. Days ago, Libya's interim Prime Minister Abdullah Al-Thani quit his post a week after the government tasked him with forming a new cabinet. Thani said that he and his family are victims of a traitorous armed attack. Thani was the country's defense minister under ousted Premier Ali Zaidan, who lost a no-confidence motion in the Libyan parliament in March. The vote of no confidence followed the standoff between the central government in Tripoli and powerful militias in the eastern region of the North African nation. Zaidan's ouster was accelerated by a row over a North Korean-flagged vessel that was illegally exporting Libyan crude. The vessel was later seized by the US forces. However, the government was heavily criticized for handling the illegal shipments. Since Gaddafi's fall, Libya has been torn among multiple rival heavily armed militia groups, while the central government has been weak, unable to practice its authority over the country. Meanwhile, clashes over control of the oil-rich east of the country have left many people dead so far. People blame the militiamen and the weak government for the situation. The resulting lawlessness has allowed terrorists to move weapons and fighters easily across borders. Critics of the Western military intervention say the campaign made the situation ripe for the growth of extremist militants, fueling tribal and regional divisions.
You're watching The Debate. Joining us live from Washington is author and historian Mr. Webster Tarpley, and with us live from London is the spokesperson for the Libyan Democratic Party, Mr. Sabri Malik. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us. I'll put my first question to a guest in London. Mr. Malik, why is Libya turning into a failed state?
I am the spokesperson of the Democratic Party in Libya, just a correction. Libya is experiencing difficulties establishing democracy. There are teething problems. We have been under Gaddafi's tyranny for 42 years. To expect Libya to establish a true democracy within 3 years of the fall of Gaddafi is very unrealistic. We are on our way to establish our democracy. We are very glad, very happy that Gaddafi is gone and his clique will never come back. NATO helped us a great deal. With the help of NATO, we prevented the use of chemical weapons against Libyan people. Without the help of the Americans and NATO, Gaddafi, as he was threatening, would have used chemical weapons against Libyan cities.
But Mr. Malik, if I could just jump in here, the question here is we are agreeing that Muammar Gaddafi was a dictator and people wanted him out. What's being discussed now, if you would please elaborate for us, is why the current government is failing.
because it is failing because we don't have a culture of democracy in Libya yet. This democracy is very alien to most Muslims. There are very few Muslim countries who are truly democratic. We Libyans are not different. However, we want democracy, we want our freedom, and we need the help of the international community, the United Nations, to help us in this respect.
Well, let's bring in Mr. Webster Tarpley on this as well. Mr. Tarpley, what do you think has made the central government weak? What is making it incapable of reining in the militia? I mean, it couldn't even stop a South Korean vessel from carrying away the country's oil.
I'm afraid what we have in Libya is a tragic monument to what I would call a criminal policy of destroying modern nation states wherever they exist and whatever their internal constitution might be. And this is, of course, the policy of the State Department and the CIA and the Foreign Office, MI6, the Quai d'Orsay and the DGSE, all were heavily involved, of mini-states, micro-states, failed states, warlords, rump states, secessionist movements, and so forth. The goal is to destroy any political unit which is strong enough to say no to the NATO, IMF, International Monetary Fund imperialism. And it's a wanton policy of political vandalism. It takes no account of what might be left after the dust has settled, when the bombing has ended. I don't see that there ever was a basis for NATO bombing. The story that was told at the time by the American and European networks was that Gaddafi was theoretically going to carry out a massacre in Benghazi. And this was whispered into the ear of Sarkozy by Bernard-Henri Lévy, the so-called philosophe. I call him a philodoxer. And of course, here in the United States, perhaps an even more prominent figure, Samantha Power, who is today the face of the United States at the United Nations. A great shame for any American to have this. She convinced Obama that it was time to do the bombing back in March of 2011. So what has come out of this now is a centrifugal process where you've got certainly Tripoli, Tripolitania going one way. You've got Cyrenaica, this axis of Tobruk, Benghazi, and Derna. They're going in another direction. You've also got Fezzan and areas in the desert that are going in another direction. I would also point out, Libya was a factor of stability for the entire Sahara and the entire Sahel. And the stuff that we've seen in Mali, in the Central African Republic, and in other areas, these tragic events, all of them have something to do with the chaos that has seized the Libyan part, which had been, I think, a big factor of stability. So I think this is absolutely criminal.
Well, let's bring Mr. Malik on this as well. Now, Mr. Malik, in 2011, we know NATO launched an attack in Libya and managed to oust and then kill Muammar Gaddafi. And that was supported, of course, by the militia who were against Gaddafi. Now the same militia are responsible for this situation of chaos. Where did NATO go wrong, do you think?
It wasn't NATO who killed Gaddafi. It was us, Libyans. We are very thankful that NATO came to our help in our hour of need. Libya will become a democracy. And I would say that the Arab Spring is having problems currently. They are to be expected. But 10 years from now, if we look back, we will see that what we are having nowadays is the beginnings of democracy in the Arab world. Tunisia has done well so far. Libya, we have done well in terms of the old regime has fallen completely collapsed. Egypt are having problems, the return of the old regime. Syria, as we all know what's happening in Syria. Yes. But overall, the Arab Spring will succeed. And ultimately, of course, we're going to have democracy in Mecca and Medina, the centers of Islam, because we cannot have democracy in the Muslim world while Mecca and Medina remain prisoners to the tyranny of the Al Saud.
Well, you see, Mr. Malik, if I could just raise a point here, those who are blaming NATO or NATO's allies here are saying, let's rather observe and find out the true intentions of NATO here. They say, for instance, now that Libya is again in an hour of need, it's facing a very volatile situation. Why is there silence? Why isn't there enough action by those who went to help Libya before? Why are these countries not taking any action now?
We in the Democratic Party called for the UN intervention, peacekeeping forces from the UN coming to Libya back in 2011. We knew that establishing democracy in Libya would be rather difficult because of the tyranny of Gaddafi and its aftermath. Nowadays, the UN is really seriously considering coming to Libya to help us. We need the political and the military help of the UN for us to establish democracy. This is nothing to be ashamed about. We don't know democracy. Most Muslims don't know democracy, but we want it, and we want our freedom, and the UN will come to our help, inshallah.
Mr. Tarpley, do you think this is about, as I guess put it, a culture of democracy?
I would see it differently. I would certainly sympathize with the wish expressed by my colleague here that Saudi Arabia could become a democratic state. That would be a great thing for the world, and I sympathize with his hopes for Libya. But I'm afraid Libya is headed towards this status of microstates, mini-states, or failed states. Even on the UN Human Development Index, where Libya had been one of the leading African and Arab states, beating out Ukraine and some countries in Latin America, it's going down, and I think it's actually gone down much further. I think the UN has cooked the statistics to try to make it look not as bad as it is. The fundamental problem you have now is armed gangs. You have a neo-feudal anarchy and chaos. You've had these figures, right? Infamous characters like Belhaj, who had been arrested in Pakistan, held by the US, former prisoner of war, or Sufyan Kumu, who came back to direct the killing of Ambassador Stevens. Of course, he did that in cahoots with forces in the American CIA. But these types of warlords now dominate the scene, and they assassinated the head of the military intelligence last year. So the question is, what force could put an end to the rule of these armed gangs? The one thing that I think needs to be perhaps looked at more closely, in the southern part of Libya, there are reports of a kind of a rapprochement between residual Gaddafi forces, there's no Gaddafi left, and black Africans or black Libyans from Fezzan. We have to remember that the current regime is built on racism. It's built on anti-black racism because of the lynchings and killings of black Africans that were carried out by the Benghazi rebel council, because they resented the black Africans as somehow being the tokens of Gaddafi's Pan-African policies, which in retrospect turned out to have been rather constructive.
Well, Mr. Malik, do you think there is a real threat or danger here that Libya could actually break apart? We are hearing a lot about the fact that these militia groups come from different regions and they're involved in clashes, and before anyone can help Libya, it may see itself breaking up.
No, Libya will never break up. That's simply because we Libyans don't want it. There are some elements, pro-Gaddafi elements, who want Libya to break up, but they are dreaming. It will never happen. We will never allow it. And the world community will never allow it. Libya will not be turned into a Somalia on the Mediterranean. Of course not. Libya is so important. It's our strategic position, our wealth. Libya will not go the Qaeda way. Libya will become democratic. It will become the Switzerland of the Mediterranean. But we need time, and we need international help.
Well, I'll just raise something that you pointed to earlier. You referred to the situation in Muslim states, including, for instance, Syria, Iraq or Egypt, etc. Those involved, as you say, in the Arab Spring. We're not seeing progress as of yet in these countries in terms of, as you say, democracy in them. And, you know, people are saying, well, this shouldn't be viewed as coincidental, because they say if we believe that it was the United States or the West or NATO that wanted to help these countries reach democracy, then why is its allies in the region, non-democratic countries like Saudi Arabia, like the Persian Gulf Arab states? It's merely the interests involved here, and they say that the interests here are those of Israel, are those of Saudi Arabia, because they want these Muslim states to remain disorderly so that they can maintain the status quo. Do you see that argument as valid?
No, I don't. I'm not here to speak for the United States. The Americans can speak for themselves, but it is in the interest of the West that the Arab world become democratic. The Cold War discourse is over now. We are not in the 1960s. We are in the 21st century. And 21st century, there'll be democracies everywhere. There'll be liberalism everywhere. There'll be secularism everywhere. And we in Libya are on our way. Despite all the problems that you are mentioning, we will make it. Libya will go secular. Libya will go democratic.
Well, before I go
and so
to,
will Egypt, of course.
Yes, before I go to, I guess, in Washington, I'm being told that we're going to take a look now at some of the comments that have been posted on our Facebook page. It's, of course, the views expressed by our viewers. We'll take a look and we'll be back.
The West wants to weaken every Muslim nation in order to control their natural resources. To achieve this, they create a proxy army in the name of Muslims who are helping and serving them. Shame on them. The West plays a big role in dividing Muslim countries into pieces and then using their resources, especially the US. There's a growing list of countries where this is happening. All shared the same evils. Their resources were being used to provide schools, hospitals, municipal infrastructures, and generally for the benefit of their populations. All shared the same fate: destruction of the infrastructure, fighting between ethnic and religious groups, many deaths, and a complete breakdown of order. Iraq and Libya are two obvious examples. The increasingly progressive Afghanistan of the 70s is an overlooked example. It was US meddling there that allowed the eventual rise of the Taliban. Syria is fighting off a Western-supported war by zealots. Iran and Venezuela need to carefully watch the US and the rest of their evil empire.
Some of the views expressed by our commentators on our Facebook page, our viewers there. I'll go straight to Washington. Mr. Tarpley, you know, a lot of those comments were referring again to the global interests involved here by the United States, etc. But I guess in London was saying that, you know, the Cold War discourse is over now and we should allow Libya to go forward and to make progress, and that it will.
Well, I'm afraid the Cold War discourse is, Cold War thinking is alive and well in the Obama administration, as we see in Ukraine. It seems to me that we've come to understand the color revolution, which was something that might have been started in Libya in the beginning of 2011, and the humanitarian bombing responsibility to protect are simply two sides to the same coin. I would also point out the link of Libya to the tragic events in Syria. I would point everybody to an article by Seymour Hersh called the Red Line and the Rat Line, which is in the London Review of Books of a couple of weeks ago. The Rat Line refers to the idea that the terrorist rebels of Libya were shipped from Benghazi, Derna, Tobruk to Turkey and then sent into northern Syria, and that is what Ambassador Stevens was doing, right? The only aspect of Libya that gets any attention in the United States is the Benghazi events of September 2012, and that, of course, had to do with the fact that Ambassador Stevens was in Benghazi as part of the shipping of fighters and military equipment taken from Gaddafi's deposits, sending that to Turkey. His last meeting was with a Turkish diplomat, and then sending that into northern Syria. So there's these are not spontaneous rebellions. They're carefully planned by NATO intelligence, with the US, the British, and the French taking the lead. Now, liberalism, it seems to me, is finished in many ways. Liberalism means the conditionalities of the International Monetary Fund. It means austerity, shock therapy, and we're seeing that in Ukraine. Countries like Libya, right, that had subsidized prices, free education, subsidies to buy cars, to buy homes and everything. All of that, I believe, has been largely wiped out because that's what the International Monetary Fund and Madame Lagarde have demanded. And nobody in the world in his right mind wants that. So I think the future is tragic for the moment until a leader or some form of organization reemerges in Libya.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Webster Tarpley, author and historian, with us there live from Washington. I'm afraid we've run out of time. I'd also like to thank our guest in London with the Libyan Democratic Party, Mr. Sabri Malik. Thank you so much, everyone, for staying with us here on another edition of The Debate. From me, Homa Liski. Until our next program, it's goodbye.